Hit record. Okay. Tamarinde, over to you. You can start sharing screen and I'll allow you to introduce yourself as well.
Okay, wonderful. Can you see my slides? Perfect, thanks. So I want to start by emphasizing that I did not do this study alone and that I benefited from a very knowledgeable and helpful steering committee that you see on the slide here. So when we talk about pre-registration, people often say things like, oh, this can strengthen the credibility or the transparency of the work. And then they often have two ways in mind. And the first is that this openness about the information on the study really encourages the researcher to carefully reflect on different study aspects and to systematically report on their design and analysis choices, including those that are made as the study sort of progresses. And the second thing that people mention is that these records about the study design and analysis plan help the reviewer or the user of the study in assessing the study's quality, because the pre-registration can provide this sort of structured insight into how the study was thought out and set up. And in the current landscape, we see more and more stakeholders sort of looking at pre-registration with interest. So here we'll talk about stakeholders. I have in mind funders or maybe disciplinary organizations and journals. But you may wonder, you talk about pre-registering qualitative research. Isn't pre-registering qualitative research inherently counterintuitive, as one of the functions of pre-registration is to distinguish exploratory research from sort of more confirmatory research? And qualitative research is often exploratory by nature. But I want to argue that usefulness may extend more widely than is immediately apparent. So for one thing, pre-registration may be helpful for forms of qualitative research that do involve an element of testing, and yes, some do. But it may also bring greater clarity to research that operates on a more exploratory or iterative logic, because even when exploring, scholars usually bring knowledge, prior knowledge or theoretical preconceptions to the study, and the pre-registration can then help distinguish which aspect of a study's findings drew on and which really diverge from those initial beliefs or expectations. And when we started this work of trying to compile a template for qualitative pre-registration, there had been some sort of papers published on this, but that really had been no sort of involvement with the community whom it was supposed to serve. And we tried to get that community input through a Delphi study. That is a structured group communication method to find a set of items that a community agrees upon. Consists of consecutive questionnaires with feedback reports in between. And, similar to a regular survey, you can reach out to an otherwise dispersed group. And instead of having these sort of things in person, people all do this anonymously and online. So there's not one person that can really dominate. And you can see our design here in this flowchart. You can see we had 2 rounds that collectively with the preparatory phase led into the final form. So I thought it was nice to give you a very quick overview of what such a feedback process looked like. So for example, in our first round, we put forth a term called sampling strategy. And then we got a whole lot of feedback from our participants, and people were confused, like, isn't sampling something much more statistic? Don't you mean selection of cases? So we tried again in a second round, and this time we used case selection strategy. And then people got us and they were like, no, actually you're talking about 2 different things. You can have your sample of, say, participants, and within those select particular cases. So to their credit, the final item here now, for example, reads sampling and case selection strategy. So we developed this agreement-based form for pre-registering qualitative research, but it's pivotal to assure that the strength of qualitative research, which is precisely its flexibility to adapt and adjust and respond, is not lost in pre-registration, because ultimately this should be a plan and it shouldn't be a sort of a prison for people. I also want to emphasize that the use of this form is completely voluntary, and that the pre-registration should provide a systematic starting point for a study, and especially in qualitative research, it needs to be updated as the study evolves. And I'm aware that quantitative research is a very diverse area, so this form may not be optimally suited for every study. And as you might see later, it overlaps quite substantially with parts of reporting guidelines for qualitative research. I personally think that's useful because ideally, doing a pre-registration already helps you or facilitates you in reporting the final findings. And I want to end on saying that there is at this point no empirical evidence to indicate that pre-registering a qualitative study leads to better study quality. But if we ever want to tackle that question empirically, we need a lot of good examples. So this is from 2 days ago. There are already quite some examples of qualitative pre-registrations out there. If you're interested, you can pre-register your qualitative study on the Open Science Framework. It will be listed on this sort of menu that I showed to you here. And you can also scan this QR code to get a little bit more of a detailed version of the story I just like to wrap up. But in the meantime, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamarinde, right on time. Our next speaker is Robert Thibault, who will be presenting a talk titled A Peer Review Intervention to Improve Transparent Reporting.
The Zoom bar is blocking my uploading slideshow. There we go. All right. Is it my screen shared? Great. Thanks for tuning in. So I'm going to talk about a peer review intervention to improve transparent reporting. And in this context, by transparent reporting, I'm specifically talking about reporting accurately in relation to what was pre-planned. So in a prospective registration or a pre-registration. I have a full-length version of this talk that I did last week, and the slides, and I have the links for those in the bottom corner, which I'll post in the chat after I'm done. So how did I get into this type of work? One day I was at work as normal, and I got an email from a journal that I'd never heard of, which of course means that 2 minutes later, I'm going to get another email from that same journal that's going to ask me to review for them. And so I got the invitation to review, downloaded the manuscript, did the review, realized it was pre-registered. Was happy that it was pre-registered, was just about ready to submit my review, then I realized, hey, I didn't even look at the pre-registration. I said, oh, this is great, it's pre-registered, but I didn't even look. So eventually I opened the pre-registration and realized the reporting was reporting an almost completely different study than what they reported was pre-registered. And so there's massive discrepancies between what they said they would do and what they actually did. And so I've called these pre-registration publication discrepancies. And they can be anything from a change in sample size like this to a change in the outcome measures. In the registration, you might say the rate of something and then report the time of it. It can be any change in analyses, hypotheses, outcome measures, sample size, etc. Do these discrepancies matter? I would argue they do. They increase the likelihood that results are biased, and when they're undisclosed, they reduce transparency about risk of bias. Now, importantly, discrepancies may indicate bias. They don't mean something is necessarily biased. And also, if the discrepancies are disclosed, that's fine, no problem. Sometimes we need to change what we planned. Do you check registrations when you peer review? So there's one study that looked at this back in 2013, and it showed that about 1/3 of reviewers of clinical trials report that they checked registrations. So if the peer reviewers aren't checking it, we can't really expect readers to be checking it either. So what did we do? For one, we ran a meta-analysis which encompassed over 6,000 publications and their registrations, and found that about 1/3 of them, with a big range around there, so somewhere between 10 and 68%, had a discrepancy in their primary outcome. And that only about 8% of these were actually disclosed. So there's a sufficient amount of discrepancies and not many of them are disclosed. So we decided to try to come up with an intervention to reduce discrepancies before a paper is published. And we called this discrepancy review. Now what this looked like, it's not too complicated. We partnered with some journals. When they received a manuscript that was pre-registered, they sent it to review like normal. They also sent it to us. And we had one person specifically assigned to discrepancy review, where they just checked the registration, checked the submitted manuscript, and wrote a reviewer report based on that. And then they continued with manuscript handling as normal. In practice, what does discrepancy review look like? It looks like a horrible game of spot the difference that I don't think anybody is too enthusiastic to actually be conducting themselves. But it has its purpose, perhaps. So importantly, we ran a feasibility study. We didn't actually run whether discrepancy review works, but we ran a feasibility study to see if we could run a trial that would answer whether it works in terms of reducing discrepancies or making sure that they're disclosed. What we found is we managed to adjust the process to bring it down to a time that's actually reasonable to implement. So on average, about 30-40 minutes to perform this process, which journals might be able to implement or hire somebody for. We found that registrations often lacked comprehensiveness and precision, which made this process more difficult. Submitted manuscripts hardly ever disclosed discrepancies. The authors addressed most of the comments that we gave them, and we decided a trial is likely feasible, but still could have some hiccups. So discrepancy review is kind of one way we could improve transparent recording and research quality. I think there's a lot of other ways. And if we think of the research process as this orange arrow here, from idea conception to publication and post-publication, a lot of the efforts we're doing in meta-research and open science, I feel, are more towards the end of the research pipeline, including discrepancy review, what I just talked about. I think we could spend more energy doing efforts that occur earlier in the process, and that would align us so that we're working with researchers rather than having a feeling that we're working against them or trying to catch them or challenge them. These type solutions, I think, would work because they would make research better and make research easier. In summary, discrepancies are common, policing them might work, but better yet, we could work with researchers to front-load good research practice. And on that, I'll say thanks to collaborators and funders.
Thank you, Robert. Our next speaker is Limor Peer, and Limor will be presenting a talk titled Stewardship and Curation of Computationally Reproducible Research. And if you have slides, you should be able to share them now.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yes, I'm going to be talking a little bit about stewardship and curation of computationally reproducible research, and I'm very glad I'm following Robert because I think we're going to end up making some similar points. I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on this project and our funder. So the kind of research I'm going to be talking about is mostly in the social science, and it's based in quantitative methods. It's the kind of research that we see in a lot of our journals. There's this great quote from Simine about how do we know whether this is high quality or not, and what do we mean by quality? And so improving the levels of transparency and having more reproducible research is one measure of quality, and that is one of the main reasons why we're doing the work that we're doing. We're thinking about reproducibility basically as a quality measure. And so in the NASEM report that came out in 2019, they talked a lot about not just data and code, but also about information about the computational methods and all of the complete research compendium that underlies the reported results. And that is the information that we're dealing with when we're talking about curation and stewardship. So let's pause for a second on what we mean by this. So curation is really a process of reviewing and enhancing the research compendium with the goal of long-term usability. And stewardship really refers to the caretaking responsibilities of whoever it is that is doing these functions. We do that so that we can have a complete and functional scholarly record that aligns with FAIR principles and other community standards on long-term archival and preservation. We think that curation is best handled by trained professionals, although it doesn't have to be. Other actors can act on behalf of these caretaking institutions like journals, like repositories or libraries or institutions. And one of the main functions that we do is assess whether computational reproducibility can be achieved using these digital artifacts, using the research compendium that we receive from the authors that underlie the scientific claims. And we think that it's important to do this pre-publication or pre-sharing or pre-archival because we don't want to archive and save things that will not be reproducible in the long term. But there is definitely a role for post-publication activities along these lines as well. So we think of curators really as the first reusers. So these are kind of like the folks who are on the front lines who will be interacting with these materials, potentially before other researchers had a chance to because it wasn't shared yet. And their goal is to enhance and improve the materials, including assess their reproducibility. So a very common and sort of pedestrian comment that we often see is we don't understand what the data represents, right? So we want to go back to the authors and ask them to clarify about that. And this is something that's very common in data archives, the level of data curation that they perform. And I won't spend a lot of time here at all, but I just want to point out that we are working off of a framework that builds on top of these gold standard data curation practices that include reviewing the files, reviewing the documentation, reviewing the data, and add this aspect of code review. And that a lot of the activities that we are doing also map onto the FAIR principles really well, in terms of also making the research compendium and the components that it includes findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So in addition to the variable level labels that are missing, we also often come across issues around privacy. Again, we're dealing with social science research, so there's an assessment of disclosure risk. And sometimes we will find a data set that has variables that might include information that could potentially identify participants, even though the authors assured us that it's not there. And so one of the goals of the curation staff is to apply de-identification techniques, remove the disclosure risk, or minimize it. Oftentimes we see output discrepancies. So this is when we run the analysis with the scripts that are provided and we see a discrepancy in the results. Now, I gave a very benign example here, and oftentimes we find very benign discrepancies, but what do we do about that? There are many reasons why you might get a discrepancy, but do we want to note that somewhere to make it easier for further future users to fix this? And then there's sometimes messy code as well that we might try to improve if that's required. So there's a lot here. I just want to focus your attention on one thing here. Well, a couple things. The blue in the middle is research life cycle. The light blue has to do with the additional norms and changes in technology and in policy that have to do with reproducibility. The red really indicates new functions that have to be taken, and a lot of them on the left-hand side of your screen be done well with partners. To sum up, I think that we can say reproducible standard for archived research compendia includes verifying for reproducibility, and there's definitely room for partnerships between scholars and professionals to make research more reproducible.
That's time. Thank you. All right. Our next speaker is Julia Bottesini, presenting a lightning talk titled How Do Science Journalists Evaluate Research? Over to you, Julia.
Hi, everyone. Let's see if I can share my screen. How's that? Can everyone see me or my screen? Great. Thank you. All right. So my name is Julia, and I ran a study to try to understand how science journalists evaluate research. And these are some of the results from that. So first, why did we want to ask this question in the first place? And basically, which findings get reported really matters. It matters for scientists because it can affect our hiring, promotion, funding prospects. And it matters for the public because we want people to be well informed. So we probably want to make sure that the highest quality research is getting the most attention. How are we trying to answer this question? We have a sample of 181 science journalists, so like real science journalists. And we asked each of them to read 8 of 22 fictitious study vignettes. In these vignettes, we manipulated 4 variables: the prestige of the university where the research took place, the sample size for the study, the sample type, so whether it was a more representative or a convenience sample, and the p-value of the main result, which could be higher and closer to 0.05, or it could be lower and below 0.005. Here's an example of what it looks like. Where I've added the red, those are the words that would change when we manipulated our variables, and this is just one example of a vignette. So the outcome that we're going to talk about is perceived trustworthiness of the studies. We measured that as the average of 4 items, which participants rated on a 7-point scale. To analyze these data, we looked at the main effect of each manipulated variable. on study trust, but we also added an intercept for each participant to account for people's general tendency to rate studies as more or less trustworthy, and also an intercept for each vignette to account for the fact that some studies might be perceived as more trustworthy for other things than the ones that we manipulated. So here are the results. On the x-axis, we have the estimated change in rated trustworthiness, and this is in raw units. So in number of points on the scale, basically. And on the y-axis, you'll see that the 4 variables that we manipulated, and all of these effects are in the direction that we expected would increase trust, or would increase trust in our science journalists. So for example, the effect of having a representative sample instead of a convenient sample. So first, we can't really infer anything about having a representative sample in the study. It might matter a little bit, but probably not. We also don't want to read very much into the p-value result. A smaller p-value does seem to have a tiny but real effect. This is not a practically meaningful effect. And we don't know if this is maybe because there were like a few people in our sample that cared a lot and most people didn't care at all. Yeah, we don't know why. And we do see that sample size seems to be relevant to journalists' ratings of trust. So this could be because the information was more salient, or maybe journalists were looking for that specifically. But it's interesting that, at least in the context of this study, this information mattered more than the other 3 things that we manipulated. And finally, I feel reasonably confident saying that the university prestige part didn't seem to make a whole lot of difference, which is nice, but it was very unexpected. We definitely had strong priors on this one, and this result was surprising. So we're in the process of writing up this and other results from the study. So hopefully a preprint will be available soon. And you should feel free to follow any of the authors on Twitter if you want to hear about it when we do have a preprint. That's it, and thanks.
Thank you, Julia. Our final speaker in this session is Cristian Constantin, who will be presenting a lightning talk titled "The Open Science Discourse as a Means for the Advancement and Communication of Science." Over to you.
Thank you. Indeed, I'll be talking about open science discourse and its potential to contribute to science, and particularly its communication and content. I would like to acknowledge first the great contribution by Priscilla, who is more acquainted with the communication part of science. We will be talking about the geographical distribution of open science research, as well as the academic fields that embrace it more, and also about the classification of this research in terms of open science. Now, what you will be seeing are the preliminary results of a literature review based on something like 1,000 articles retrieved from the Web of Science and published up to 2020. We started this exercise by creating this simple but we believe eloquent map as a starting point when discussing open science, its entanglement with the academic community, as well its potential to be to the forefront of the scientific discourse, either innovative or at least novel perspectives. In practical terms, we see that something like 90% of open science research comes from Europe and North America. We also see that something like 80% of open science research at global level originates in 10 most intensive open science prone countries, a top dominated by European and North American countries, with 2 notable exceptions, Australia and Brazil. This is also confirmed when we look at cities. more or less 50% of the research coming from the top open science research intensive cities in the world. It's also interesting to take a look that together with the popularity of the open science concept, it's the practice basically spread. We looked at 5 general research areas and more than 100 specific disciplines open science has been associated with along the years. And what we see is that social science and technology, these 2 fields have been more prone to adopt open science at global level. However, the distribution presents some peculiarities depending on the different geographical context we look at. In particular, we noticed social sciences and technology, respectively, being more fun to deal with in Europe and Asia, while, for instance, life science and biomedicine, the part in orange on the graph, that has been more popular in North America and Australia. We also see that when we do a country level analysis, this is also relevant in the case, for instance, what we have here on the screen, the continental champions, namely the countries with the most research output incorporating open science. Now, taking our curiosity at the next level, we looked closely within these general research areas in order to pinpoint to those specific disciplines more eager to follow an open science path. Addressing this at the city level context, out of the 100 plus specific disciplines, you may see here the main 5 or 6 which define the research in these more or less randomly chosen cities, noticing the correlation between the research areas and the concerned disciplines or subcategories. If by chance there are any panelists coming from either one of these cities, might confirm or not the perspective we are proposing here. In parallel with the popularity that I've been mentioning, the conceptual evolution of open science prompted us to a closer look into the specific open science traits adopted around the world. And in the interest of time, I won't present you the classification we have developed inspired by existing other classifications or taxonomies. What I would say that, for instance, in the same city level context, what we see is a predilection for conceptual and theoretical studies for the necessary infrastructure to adopt and practice open science, as well as for the values that could be upholded by means of open science. Obviously, I will go to conclusions.
Yeah.
Indeed, I will have to open to stop here.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking all of our lightning talk speakers today in any way you would like, with reactions or in chat.
Thanks, everyone.
And please do feel free to head over to the Amos Slack space if you want to continue the conversations with the speakers as well. And we will hopefully very smoothly transition into our next session. Let me just stop recording for a second.